Today we're going to look at the story that the Haggadah opens up with. We're going to see the halachic value of this story. It's the beginning part. It's going to cover a little bit. And then in the next section, we're going to look at the details of the story, specifically the characters of the story, how the characters of the story are listed, and see how the way in which they're listed matches the precise placement in history and the relationship between the various different characters. Now, I say it's right at the beginning because the Haggadah starts off after we've done Kiddush and after we've had the Karpas. Then we break the middle matzah, and then we begin the actual Haggadah, the actual relating of the story. At the beginning, we begin with the Halach Ma'anya, which is a kind of introduction to the Haggadah, where we welcome our guest. And then we go to the Mahrash, and that's the children's question, because the Torah prescribes the way in which the story is to be told in the night of the Seder, is that the children ask and we respond. And then we respond to the answer to the question. And the answer there is in the first paragraph, which is, we were slaves to Egypt, to Pharaoh in Egypt. And we go on to say, and then that paragraph concludes with the following words. You can see it in Hebrew here, and if you have the printout, you can see it in English there as well. Even if we were all sages, we were all very understanding, and we knew all of Torah. It's a commandment for us to retell the story of the Exodus. It's an actual mitzvah. The fact that it's a mitzvah itself, the Rebbe has a big pilpul on that. I'm debating to go into that tonight, but it's very halachic in nature, and we kind of got a sense of the Rebbe's halachic analysis when we did the first class. So I figured we'll do something a little different from the history side. Anyway, but that this is in itself, the fact that the Haggadah tells us that the mitzvah, that the relating of the story is itself a mitzvah, that itself is a pilpul. There's a whole discussion exactly how and what exactly is the qualification of this mitzvah. And likewise, the Rebbe has a lengthy discussion on, well, if it's a mitzvah, why don't we make a bracha? Before we do any mitzvah, we say make a bracha. Before you shake the lulav, before you hear the shofar. So if there's a mitzvah to retell the story of the Exodus, why don't we make that bracha? But that's not for now. And then it goes on to say, okay, so because we just came out of Egypt, this is what we're telling the child in response to this question. Because we came out of Egypt, and therefore, even if we were all wise, and even if we knew all of Torah, we still have the commandment to retell the story of the Exodus. And l'chol hamarba, and anyone who elaborates more, l'saper b'tzis Mitzrayim, in the story, in retelling the story of the Exodus, harez meshubach, this is praiseworthy. So there's a minimum requirement, the mitzvah, of how much you have to retell in the story. And then there is, the more you elaborate, the better it is. And then from there, the Haggadah launches into Ma'aseh, the story of Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah, and Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon. They were sitting together in Bnei Brak at the night of the Seder. And they were discussing the story of the Exodus throughout the entire night. To the point that their students came to them and told them, Rabbi Seinu, our teachers, it's time to say the morning Shema. So they said all night. Okay, that's the story. So I began with the paragraph before because there was going to comment and explain why the story is necessary. And it leads from the previous paragraph. Right, the previous paragraph, the end of the paragraph of Avodah Bayinu. The paragraph where we describe that we were slaves in Egypt in response to the child's question, Manashtana. That paragraph concludes, as we saw earlier, that even if we're all wise, etc., we still have the mitzvah to retell the story, even though we know all of Torah and we know the whole story. Nonetheless, we still have the mitzvah to retell it. So says the Rebbe, and what's the proof that we all have to tell the story, even though we are great scholars, because Ma'aseh b'Rebbe Lezer, because of the story. So now we know why the story comes at this point in the Haggadah, and why it's right here as an introduction, because this story is proof that no matter how scholarly we are, we're still obligated to retell the story, and the longer the better. Because here you see 5 scholars who certainly know all of Torah and certainly knew the story of the Exodus, and yet they spent the entire night talking about it. Now, why would they do that? They do that because there's a mitzvah to do so. And therefore, this is the flow of the Haggadah. We start by responding to the child and saying we were slaves in Egypt. And we conclude by saying because we were slaves in Egypt, therefore we have a mitzvah to retell the story. And this mitzvah applies no matter how scholarly we are. And what's the proof that it applies to no matter how scholarly we are? The proof is because look, these 5 scholars sat down together and studied the Haggadah all night long. Then the Rebbe says as follows. Another halachic derivation from the story. Right? The first thing we derive from the story is the fact that no matter how scholarly we are still obligated to retell the story. And then the Rebbe quotes the word v'chol hamarba, and anyone who increases in the story, the better it is. Now he continues. Va'afilu kohenim u'leviyim, even Kohens and Levis, shaloi nishtabdu, which were not enslaved. The Kohens and the Levites, the tribe of Levi, lived in the land of Goshen, while the rest of the Jews were enslaved. So they were living in Egypt, but they were not enslaved. The Gadim, as well converts, they too are obliged to retell the story. And what's the rayal and what's the proof? The proof is also from the story. The story of the 5 sages who sat together all night studying and relating the story of the Exodus. In Bnei Brak, that's the proof that a Kohen, Levi, and a convert who weren't necessarily part of the Exodus, they too are obligated to retell the story. How to retell the story of the Exodus? What's the proof? Because Ma'aseh Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shua, there was a story with Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shua, and Rabbi Shua was a Levi. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, who was a Kohen. Rabbi Akiva, who's Ben Gadim, who came from converts. Rabbi Tarfon, who was a Kohen. So you have 2 Kohens, you have a Levi. I'm not sure if Rabbi Eliezer was also a Levi, but you have 2 Kohens and a Levi, and Rabbi Akiva, who is the son of a Ger, and all of them are there spending the entire night retelling the story. And this is proof that no matter what type of Jew you are, you're still obligated. So here we have another halachic reason why the story comes at this point in this Haggadah, at the beginning. After we tell the child the basic answer to this question, because we were slaves. And because we're slaves, therefore there's the mitzvah to tell the story. No matter how smart we are, we should tell the story, because look at these 5 guys, they're much smarter than we are, and they told the story all night. And no matter what kind of Jew you are, you have to tell the story. Certainly if you're an Israelite and you were part of the enslavement, definitely. But even if you're a Kohen or a Levi or a convert who weren't necessarily part of the Exodus, nonetheless, you're also obliged to retell the story as proof by these 5 scholars, 1 of which came from converts, 2 of which is a Kohen, and at least 1 of them is a Levi. So you already have here that the story sets the stage halachically as to why we're about to do what we're doing, why we're about to go on and elaborate in the story. Here's the proof that we're all obligated to do so. Now, something interesting here in the Rebbe's wording, and I want to show you how precise the Rebbe's wording is. I kind of alluded to it, but if you look closely, the Rebbe says like this: even if we're Kohen and Levis, shaloi nishtabdu, that we're not enslaved, v'gedim and converts. And the Rebbe kind of separates, it seems, Kohen and Levi and convert. Why not all 3? Vafilu Kohenim u'Levi and v'gedim. Whether you're a Kohen, Levi, or a Ger, or a convert. Why break it up with these words, shaloi nishtabu, that they weren't enslaved? All 3 of them weren't enslaved. Neither the convert wasn't enslaved either. So he could have said, Vafilu Kohenim u'Levi and v'gedim, shaloi nishtabdu. Even Kohen, Levi, or converts who were not enslaved, they too have to. And what's the proof? Because of these 5 scholars, some of which were Kohen, Levi, and converts. Why break it up? Kohen, Levi, who are not enslaved, and converts. So perhaps, maybe, by looking at the source, from where the Rebbe gets this idea, the source comes from the Sichos HaRegel. The Sichos HaRegel is a commentary from the Haggadah. You can see here the Haggadah is Rabbi Yosef David Azulai, famous Sephardic commentator. You can see that here's where you're from, Yerushalayim in Italy. Okay, so it's a bit small, it's hard to see here, and I couldn't find a better print. And here he says like this. So he tells us his idea, and he says, you might also suggest, I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's going to take up too much time, but essentially he says, let's find. Okay, so it's like this. Now he explains the reason why the Kohen and Levi should be retelling the story, even though they were not enslaved. And he says, "V'yesh b'zatam." There's a reason. The shvach, dehein lu yiyeh shaloi nishtabanu. It's indeed nishtabdu, even though it's true. It's hard for me to read this, but I think this is what he's saying. Although it's true that the Kohen and Levis were not enslaved, they were in their own autonomous. They were autonomous. They were on their own. Nonetheless, they were still not allowed to leave Egypt. So even though they weren't enslaved, but they were still in Egypt and they were still in exile. And the Haggadah Hashem lasais sheyetzu am Yisrael b'yadrama, and Hashem so decided to take the Jews out with a great and, right? God took the Jews out of Egypt. And they too were taken out, even though they weren't enslaved. Moreover, we know that if the Jews, I think that's the right word, but the content is definitely correct of what I'm saying, but I don't know if I'm getting every word right because it's hard for me to see them. But if God forbid, we know that if God forbid, the Jews were not to leave, and they were to stay in Egypt for one moment, I think it's supposed to be Shadei Tuma. They would enter into the lowest levels of impurity. But Nun, should be, I think, into the 50th level of impurity. That's a Kabbalistic idea that the Jews were sunken in a very low level of impurity. And had the Jews stayed one more moment in Egypt, they would be stuck in that level of impurity. And you in Avodim, they would have been lost. The Efsher, and perhaps, says the Chida, that the Kohen and Levis, even though they weren't enslaved, they too would have been affected by this impurity that Jews were stuck in. And therefore, the fact that they were taken out also affected them. Okay. So this is what he writes. Then he says like this. I'm not sure what that is. I think that's what the word is. When I delivered this talk, these words, before another great scholar, he told me the Kain Pirshu that indeed this is correct. This is also the way he understood it. B'hoisif nefech shaper, I'm not sure. He added to this, shehu pirush b'chol ha'maber l'rabbis kohenim v'levim v'gedim, to add also converts. And he says, v'gam gedim v'zarim lo nishtablu, even though the converts were not, and their children were not enslaved, v'lo hayu mi'ikra tisis mizrayim, and therefore, there's more of a reason to say that converts are not part of this mitzvah because they weren't there, but nonetheless, they still are there. So in other words, what you see here from the Simchas HaRegel, from this commentary from the Haggadah, is that there are two levels. There is the Kohen and Levi, which the enslavement wasn't their issue, but they still had the issue of exile. So the fact that they have to say this story is not as big of a chiddush, it's not as big as a novelty, because at least they were still a little bit affected according to their Chida, because even though they weren't enslaved, they were still there and they might have been affected by the impurity. But the converts is a greater chiddush that they have to. And that's perhaps why the Rebbe separates it here. Even Kohen and Levim who were there, but weren't enslaved. They were affected, but they weren't enslaved. And Gedim, who weren't even there, they also have to retell the story. And what's the proof? Because of the story. And Rabbi Kiva is a ger, it's a convert. Now, as for the fact that Gedim have to say the Haggadah, that's something that we discussed this earlier, and it's not for now. I'm just pointing out this interesting language, and perhaps this is why the Rebbe separates it. Because Kohen and Levi are it's one novelty, the fact that they have to say the story, because they were there and it has an effect on them, even though they weren't enslaved. But for converts, it's even a bigger chiddush, it's even a bigger novelty, because they weren't even there. Anyway, the end is that they spiritually were there, and the Rebbe discusses why it is that Gedim indeed do say the Haggadah. That's something the Rebbe discusses earlier, but not for now. Okay. Just a question for those who are interested. This is a question that I don't know the answer to. Why this is the opening words here? Why is there commenting this idea that the Kohen Levi and the Ger should be saying the Haggadah? Why is it on the words of V'chol HaMarba? Why these words? Why is it these words that he's commenting on?
That's what in the Chida it says that also, and they were
the
never
Chida
blessed.
Said, what did he say? What did he say? What?
Yeah, where you stopped reading, it said harbu the stopper Yetzias Mitzrayim.
Where?
Even though he's the first paragraph on the second column The last.
Yeah, on top here.
Yeah, on top there.
Yeah, even so, they did a lot. But the point,
Yeah.
the chiddush is that they did a mitzvah. The chiddush is that they have a mitzvah l'chlal, right? It could be that the Rebbe is alluding to this over here. The Shalah writes over here. I'm sorry, the Chidah writes over here. Derech HaTzachos, he writes. Where is it? He says that the word v'chol is it? Oh, v'chol is a Rosh Tevis. Va'afilu kohen Levi. Maybe. V'chol is va'afilu kohen Levi. Vav chaf lamed. Maybe that's what the Rebbe puts it there. Shvach, maybe. Anyway. Okay. Now we go back to the Rebbe. This is.
Isn't it a bigger chiddush to be marba than to be
well, once you have a mitzvah.
mitzvah?
Yeah, but once you have the mitzvah, then obviously the more you do the mitzvah, the better, right? No, it's the fact that kol marba l'saper hadezim meshubach. I mean, like that's seems like a maybe that's it. Maybe. V'chol marba, and all those you add, meaning even those who aren't obligated, but they add anyway. So you're saying that they're not obligated, and they're not obligated, but they're adding anyway, and therefore it's praiseworthy. But the Rebbe said earlier that they are obligated.
Saying that the word that the paragraph I pointed out that Rabbi Akiva was from Gerim, and even though he's from Gerim and he has no,
they still did a lot. Right, so my question to you is: do they have a mitzvah to do it or not?
So we say that
they do a mitzvah, right?
Yeah.
They're obligated. Where did the Rebbe say that? They spoke about this. Where? Anyway, okay, maybe. Maybe. Yeah. Earlier, the Rebbe said that the Gerim are obligated as well as Kohen and Levi, certainly. Anyway, okay, it's still not clear. Okay, let's go forward. We have a lot of
maybe the point is just that even though they're not obligated, you would think that these types, because of the situation, they would do me'ikar adin, they have the mitzvah, but even then v'chol marbin, that they're why would they be marbin? But they're in v'chol, so the harizim and shubach.
So you're saying that they don't have a chiyuv.
No, they have a chiyuv, but you would think that they would limit it. They wouldn't be marbin.
Oh, meaning that, like, I guess, is that what you're saying, Moshe? That they would do it v'yoytze, but they don't care for it so much. But you see here that they did care for it and they did a lot. Okay, that could be. Could be. Okay, let's go weiter. Now that I have a comment on the actual story. There's a lot of material to cover. I hope we're able to do everything. But I really urge you to print out these pages and look at the rest of the stuff. You'll be able to do it yourself. A lot of it's in English, and it's some fascinating stuff, and it'll create a fuller picture when you do that. So let's begin. Sefer Rebbe Lezer. So before the Rebbe gets into the details of the characters in the story, first of all, where the story comes from. So says the Piskazu, this paragraph, this story, Yeshna Kvar B'Seder Haggadah Rav Amram Goin. It exists already in the Haggadah as it's organized by Rav Amram Goin. Who's Rav Amram Goin? So I put here in the line over here, Rav Amram Goin, where he lived, 875. Surah is one of the big yeshivas of Bavel of Babylonia. This is the post-Talmudic era. The post-Talmudic era is known as the era of the Gaonim. Gaon means genius, or also means like gaiva, like pride, like the pride of the Jewish people. And the name Gaon was reserved for those who were the head of the Jewish academy. And there were two. There was one in Pompadisa and one in Surah. And these Gaonim wielded great spiritual power, halachic power. They wrote responsa, and they really were like the epicenter and the final word of all matters Jewish, related to Jewish religion or thought or philosophy or whatever. So Rav Amram Goin is one of the earliest Haggadahs that we know of in the organized fashion that we have. We've talked about the history of the Haggadah in the previous occasion, the previous year. Rav Amram Goin is one of the earliest ones. And in his Haggadah, the story of Rabbi Lezer exists. Now this statement, Yeshna Kfar B'Seder Haggadah, already exists in the Haggadah is an interesting language. You should just say it's there. What's kfar? As if it's already there. Now, maybe it's because in a later Haggadah, which is also early, the Mahzor Vitri. Last week we quoted the Mahzor Vitri, which is the Haggadah which is the Seder, of the student of Rashi. And over there's a Haggadah in that Seder. And that Mahzor Vitri does not have this story in it. So this Haggadah of Rabbi Amram Goim, which predates the Haggadah of Rashi, does have it, whereas the later one doesn't have it. And that might explain this language. It already exists in Rabbi Amram Goim's Haggadah, even though it doesn't exist in later Haggadahs. Maybe. Then the Rebbe continues. Now, V'niskedes b'Tosfos, and this passage is quoted in Tosfos, even though the Tosfos, we talked about last week, they're students of Rashi, but nonetheless, it's mentioned in Tosfos, Dibra HaMaskal B'Chashiv in Exudes, and Dibra HaMaskal Amar in Avodah Zarah. So there are two times when Tosfos quotes this story of the Haggadah. We'll look at those Tosfos in later. And then the Rebbe says, but Tosfos, I'm going to translate as literally as I can, because I want to hear from you how you think, what you think the Rebbe means. Now, in Tosfos, Mitzayin Mekayma, in Tosfos, he cites that the source of this story, of the 5 scholars sitting in Bnei Brak and studying all night, La Agadas HaPesach, to the Haggadah of Pesach. Now, Le'esata, and as of right now, says the Rebbe, Le'motzasiya b'shum medrash, I have not found the story anywhere in the medrash. But Re'ei Tosefta, Sefer the Rebbe, see Tosefta in the end of Tractate Pesachim. Tosefta is the Mishnaic age text that didn't make it to the final cut of the Mishnah, so it's that same era. And over there, Ma'isa Ke'enze is a similar story, but not with these 5 scholars, but rather with Rabbi Gamliel in Lud, where they spent the entire night studying the laws of Pesach, etc. So before we get to what I want to point out to you, let's just look at this Tosefta. And I want to just again show you things that are like on my mind that don't necessarily have resolves. Maybe later we'll see something that will help. So let's look at this Tosefta, this Mishnaic age text in the end of Masechta Brachos, and in the Masechta Pesachim. So here's the text. Ma'aseh Rabbi Gamliel v'Zakenim. There is a story of Rabbi Gamliel and the elders. Shayim Mesubim b'beis Baisus ben Zunin. They were in the house of Baisus, son of Zunin, Belud, in the city of Lud. They were involved in the laws of Pesach kol halayla, all night. Ad kodas hagever, until the rooster crowed. The igbiu lufneim, and they lifted the tables from in front of them. V'noyadu, and they got themselves ready. The whole chulah beis medrash, and off they went to the house of study. So it's a similar story, except that they're in Lud. It's Rabbi Gamliel, not these 5 scholars, and there's no students coming to tell them time to say Shema. But the rooster calls them and tells them to go to say Shema, supposedly, or to go to the house to study. Okay. But I want to point out to you, and something that's on my mind, is look how the Rebbe quotes it. Ma'aseh ke'enze, b'Rabbi Gamliel belud, she'osku b'chas Pesach kol halayla chulu, etc. Now, when you put the word chulu, etc., you would assume that you're doing a quote, right? You're beginning a quote, and then you say etc. That's usually how the word etc. works. But the Rebbe's not actually quoting the Tosefta. Because look at the Rebbe's words. Rabbi Gamliel, belud, she'osku b'hilchas Pesach. And the wording here is not like that. Rabbi Gamliel, and then but it continues. And the elders who were in the house of Baisus, which the Rebbe skips, and then Lud. And the wording is not she'osku, but rather v'hayu oiskim b'hilchas Pesach. So it's almost as if like the word chulu, etc. doesn't really apply here. Usually the words etc. is like when you're quoting something and you say etc. as if to say go look up the rest of it. But the Rebbe doesn't like begin the quote and then say etc. The Rebbe like rephrases it and then puts the word etc. So my question is 2 things. Number one, why is he rephrasing it in this way? Right? Because in theory, all he could have said was see Tosefta, where there's a story similar to this with Rabbi Gamliel. Period. That would have been enough. Okay, you want to add that it's not just Rabbi Gamliel, that's the change, but also in Lud. Okay, so Rabbi Gamliel and Lud. And those are your 2 big changes between this story and the other story. Right? The story in Haggadah is these 5 scholars, and it was in Bnei Brak. And the story of Rabbi Gamliel is that it's Rabbi Gamliel and in Lud. Right? So why not just say, Ma'aseh ke'enze Rabbi Gamliel belud, period. What would have been missing? Nothing. Why add she'osku b'hilchas Pesach kol halayla and then add chulu, etc.? We know they're discussing the laws of Pesach. That's exactly what makes it similar to our story. So Anyway, like when I read it the first time, I thought that I was directly quoting and then saying etc. But then when I looked at it and I see it's not direct quote. So what's the etc. doing here? And then why is he rephrasing the story exactly in this way? Leave it open-ended. Perhaps later we'll come back to that. Okay, so for now I want to look at this thing, but the Rebbe says like this. Let's look at these words over here. So first the Rebbe tells us that this paragraph is found in Rav Amram Goin's Haggadah. Okay, it's already mentioned in Rav Amram Goin's Haggadah. And then he says it's mentioned in Tosfos, 2 locations where it's mentioned in Tosfos. We're going to look at those Tosfos later. And then he says in Tosfos, he cites 2 Agadas HaPesach, the Haggadah of Pesach. And as of now, I haven't found it in any Medrash. Okay, so if you just read that, what would you think the word Agadas HaPesach means? When Tosfos says he cites the story to an Haggadah of Pesach, what's it talking about? Anyone? What's it talking about? Given what you just read. Anyone? What's an Haggadah of Pesach?
The Haggadah from Masechta Pesach.
So the Haggadah from Masechta Pesach. And that's what they're saying. I haven't found it in any Medrash, right? So it looks like, from this sentence here, it looks like that the Rebbe is talking, that Tosfos is talking about some Medrash that exists, that has the Haggadah of Pesach. And the Rebbe is saying, I can't find it. That's what you would think. But this cannot be the meaning. And here's why. So earlier in the Rebbe's Haggadah, at the beginning of the Haggadah, when the word Haggadah first appears, the Rebbe has quite a number of comments on the word Haggadah, the history of the Haggadah, and so on. And then he makes the following comment just about the name Haggadah. What's the name Haggadah mean? She says like this: the Psachim, in Psachim, citation here, page 115b, the word Haggadah, which means to retell, al shem v'Haggadah lebincha, comes from the word, and you shall tell your child. You shall relate to your child the story. So the Torah uses the word you shall relate to your child, using this word Haggadah, adding the suffix ta as in you, but the root word is Haged, which is Haggadah. And that's where it seems the word Haggadah comes from. The Maamorim Psachim. Now, Yesh Mefarshim, there are those who say that Haggadah, the word Haggadah, Shuloshan Haidah, comes from the word praise, B'Shevach, and thanksgiving, LaKadosh Baruch Hu, to God, Al Sheyitzonu Meretz Mitzrayim, from taking us out of Egypt. For taking us out of Egypt. As the Jerusalem Talmud of Yerushalmi translates, Hayom Yom L'Hashem Elokecha, I arrived here to tell God. That's what the pasuk says. So the Yerushalmi translates, Shabachis Yom Adain, this day I'm going to praise you. Okay, and Rav Saja also translates the same thing in Arabic. Now, okay, so different translations to the word Haggadah. Either Haggadah means praise, or Haggadah means to retell. Now says the Rebbe, the Yesh Garson, some have it, that it's not Haggadah with a hey, but Agadah ba'alef. What's the source that it comes with an aleph? First of all, Re'ei Diktuki Sofrim L'Psachim Kuvtes Vav Tes Kuvtesayin. The Diktuki Sofrim, which is a book that has minor changes in wording in the Gemara, like, fixing emendations to the Gemara. And over there, it amends the word Haggadah twice, actually 3 times, from the word Haggadah to Agadah with an aleph. So that's source number 1 for the word Agadah, rather than Haggadah. Source number 2 is Tosfos the Ramaschal Amar Avodah Zarah Memhei Aleph. Tosfos in Avodah Zarah. That is this Tosfos here. Tosfos Avodah Zarah the Ramaschal Aleph Amar. Exact same Tosfos. So at the beginning of the Haggadah, the Rebbe already cited this Tosfos as a source for the word to be Agadah with an aleph rather than Haggadah. Now, if that's the case, when Tosfos cites the source to mean Haggadah HaPesach, what does it mean? It means the Haggadah that we're looking at right now. So Tosfos is saying that what's the source for the story of these 5 people comes from the Haggadah. Presumably, he saw it in the Haggadah of Amram Goin, who came a few centuries before the Tosfos. Yeah? Now, if that's the case, right, so this is clear. When Tosfos, the Rebbe is clearly learning that when Tosfos says the word Haggadah HaPesach, he doesn't mean some medrash. He means the Haggadah that we're looking at. That the source for the story of the 5 people is the Haggadah. That's the source of the story. Whoever wrote it, we have no idea, but the source is the Haggadah. It goes as far back as Amram Goin, probably farther back, but this is the source, is the Haggadah. So then what does the Rebbe mean when he says that as of now I haven't found it in medrash? What does that mean? What's the Rebbe saying here? Why is this coming in? What's the context here that I haven't found it in the Medrash? What's the Rebbe saying? I'm not 100% sure what the Rebbe means to say that I haven't found it in any Medrash, but perhaps he's saying that either it's not a continuation. Taisus is saying the source is Haggadah, and full stop, period. And as of now, I haven't found it in any earlier Medrash, just because a story that's phrased with these 5 scholars, phrased in such a way that it is in Haggadah, it sounds almost Mishnaic, and therefore you would assume it comes from a text that existed in that age, in that era, a Medrash, a Gemara, a Tosefta, something like that. And they were just kind of commenting in general, I haven't found it anywhere. Maybe. And that's like a prelude to the next statement, which says that I found a story similar to it in Tosefta. Maybe that. And it's just a freestanding statement that I haven't found in any Medrash. Or the Rebbe is saying, considering that as of now we haven't found in any Medrash, it stands to reason that Tosefta is correct, that the Haggadah is the source. Maybe that's what the Rebbe is saying. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm just putting it out there just so you can see kind of the way in which we might go about analyzing the Haggadah.
Why change it to Agadas HaPesach instead of just Agadah Pesach?
So say, mean Haggadah Shel Pesach?
Yeah, like why change the lashon from, if it's a hey instead of an aleph, so keep the same exact wording and letters, just change the hey and the aleph.
Meaning there shouldn't be a suf here.
Yeah.
Good question. But and you know what, I'll actually back up your question even more in a moment. But either way, you have to contend with this statement here, where the Rebbe puts the Tosfos as a source for the Haggadah being Haggadah. So you have to contend with that. Now, to add to what you're saying, and this, I don't know if this adds to confusion or helps us, but let's see here. Last week, we quoted a letter from the Rebbe, and this is the exact same letter. I mentioned to you last week that there was a person, I should really find out who it is, but anyway, there's a person, his name is in the book, who wrote a letter to the Rebbe after the Rebbe published the Haggadah, making a number of comments, and the Rebbe responds to his comments. So last week we saw the comment the Rebbe responded to him with regard to the rhyme of Kaddish Orchatz, and here the Rebbe is commenting on the word Haggadah. The Rebbe says like this: Haggadah Hashem v'gad lebencha. The word Haggadah comes from the term, and you shall relate to your children. That's what we saw earlier. Now the Rebbe says, Siyanti b'Haggadah im likutim. I cited in the Haggadah with my commentary, Sheken koseba vudram ba'oid, that there are many sources that say that the Haggadah comes from the word to relate to Gadat Lebencha. Now, the im tim tzaloymar, if you're going to suggest that the Haggadah shel Pesach, the word Haggadah shel Pesach, Pirushay, its meaning is Medrash. If you want to suggest that the word Haggadah means Medrash, Medrash means, literally in English, I think it's exegesis, which basically means things that are extrapolative, right? Stories and things that are in the surroundings of the actual subject matter. Like you have the text of the Torah with the story, and then you have the Medrash, like these surrounding stories around it. So if you want to say that's what the Haggadah means Medrash, as in the Medrash of Pesach, the surrounding story of Pesach, and that's the word Haggadah means. Says the Rebbe, in Cain, if that's the case, then the only part of the Haggadah that would be included in that term Haggadah is the part of the Haggadah that actually relates to the story, which is Ma'avodim Hayinu, from the beginning of Magid, after the questions are asked, and we start to tell the story, which begins with the paragraph of Avodim Hayinu, concluding with the end of the story, where we say, and now we're going to thank you, Hashem, for the story. But later on, where we do Hallel, and we do other things where we praise God, that's not part of Haggadah. If the word Haggadah doesn't mean, if that word Haggadah means Medrash, something just dawned on me, 1 second. Sorry, give me 1 second. Okay, I have to flip my here. Yeah. Okay. If the word Haggadah only means Medrash, then only the parts of the Haggadah that actually are Midrashic in nature would be part of the Haggadah. But we have in the Gemara and other and early Talmudic commentaries, it implies that the entirety of the Haggadah is labeled Haggadah. So therefore, the word Haggadah can't just be limited to the midrashic stories, but it has to be the entirety of the text. Okay, so this is what the Rebbe writes. So what does that mean for us? So the Rebbe is kind of saying that even the word Haggadah doesn't mean the midrashic things, because then you're limiting the scope of what the midrash means. Even though this part of the Haggadah is part of what would have been the midrashic part of the Haggadah. So again, I'm not 100% sure. Okay, now we're at the final part of this tonight's tonight's class, the characters that are in the story. So there are 5 sages mentioned in the story: Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon. The Rebbe is going to tell us why they appear in this order, and I really hope to be able to cover all the sources. And again, if not, I really encourage you to print out the sheet and look at the sources yourself. A lot of them are in English, and you'll be able to find them very fascinating stories. So let's read the Rebbe's Haggadah, and then after we read the Rebbe's comment, we'll go through the sources and see the depth of what the Rebbe is saying.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Where can we find the PDF?
I WhatsApped it in the groups. If you can get it there, send me an email afterwards, and I'll send you.
So it can be downloaded from the WhatsApp, I suppose.
Yeah. Or I can email it to you if that's better. Okay. So these are the 5 people: Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon. So the Rebbe starts with the last 2, the third and the fourth, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva. Makdim, the Haggadah places, or the storyteller places, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah and Rabbi Akiva. He puts Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah before Rabbi Akiva. Why? Because Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah was Nasi, was the prince of Israel. He was the leader of the Jews, the official leader of the Jewish people. Like, almost the king, not exactly, because the Jews were under Roman rule in Eretz Yisrael, but they had a position called the Nasi. And Nasi both had halachic power, he also had political power. He was really the leader of the Jewish people. So for 2 reasons, Eliezer ben Azariah is placed before Rabbi Akiva. Number 1, because he is from a family of Sichos, a family of great lineage, and he was a Nasi. Now, the source for this idea that Eliezer ben Azariah precedes Rabbi Akiva for these 2 reasons is from Tosfos Exudes, the same Tosfos that Rebbe quoted earlier, which we're going to see soon. Now, the Yesh Lemer might suggest, says the Rebbe, okay, so that explains why Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah comes before Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah both has lineage and he is a prince. The Yesh Lemer might suggest, says the Rebbe, why is it that Rabbi Akiva comes before Rabbi Tarfon? The other Tosfos we cited in the earlier paragraph is the Tosfos in Avodah Zarah, which again we're going to see soon. In that Tosfos asks, why is Rabbi Akiva before Rabbi Tarfon? Seemingly, Rabbi Tarfon is a teacher of Rabbi Akiva. Seemingly, Rabbi Tarfon is one of the teachers of Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon should be first. So why is Rabbi Akiva first? Says the Rebbe, because this story took place in Bnei Brak. And Rabbi Akiva Humar da Asrasham. And Rabbi Akiva was the local rabbi. He was the chief rabbi of Bnei Brak. And because he's the chief rabbi, therefore, he goes before his teacher, Rabbi Tarfon. Now, if he goes before his teacher, and here's the source on Hedron on the base, we'll see that also in a minute. Here's the source for why Rabbi Akiva, that tells us Rabbi Akiva is the chief rabbi of Bnei Brak. Now, if Rabbi Akiva is being positioned before his teacher, Rabbi Tarfon, and why is he being placed before his teacher, Rabbi Tarfon? Because he's the chief rabbi. So then why isn't he placed first? Why isn't he before Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua? Right? Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, we know, goes before Rabbi Akiva because he's the Nasi. He's the leader of the Jewish people of all of Israel. Rabbi Akiva comes before Rabbi Tarfon because he's the local chief rabbi, even though Rabbi Tarfon is a teacher. So why not before Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua? They were also Rabbi Akiva's teachers. So Rabbi Akiva here had 3 teachers, really, as far as we know so far: Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Tarfon. Now, if we're putting Rabbi Akiva before his teacher, Rabbi Tarfon, because he is the chief rabbi, then why not before Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua? So explains the Rebbe, nevertheless, he does not put him before Rabbi Yeshua, much more so before Rabbi Eliezer. The Rebbe does not explain why Rabbi Eliezer is greater than Rabbi Yeshua, but we're going to see some sources why. Why is that? Because Rabbi Yeshua Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yeshua was a teacher of Rabbi Akiva, and certainly Rabbi Eliezer was. Now, 1 second, didn't we just finish saying Rabbi Tarfon is also the teacher of Rabbi Akiva? So before he has three teachers. Rabbi Akiva has three teachers: Rabbi Shua, Rabbi Lezer, and Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Shua and Rabbi Lezer, because they're his teachers, they go first. But he goes before Rabbi Tarfon. Why? So he explains. Mashenkin Rabbi Tarfon. But when it comes to Rabbi Tarfon, Sha'av Shahaya Rabbi, even though he was his rabbi, he was a teacher. But after a later time, skip the parentheses for now. Nasa Chaveri became his friend. So Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon started out as Rabbi Akiva being a teacher, Rabbi Tarfon being a teacher, Rabbi Akiva, but later he became a friend. So because later he became a friend, and Rabbi Akiva became chief rabbi, therefore he goes before Rabbi Tarfon. Meaning like this: had Rabbi Tarfon remained his teacher, the fact that Rabbi Akiva was chief rabbi wouldn't have put him before him, because chief rabbi still gives deference to their teacher, like Rabbi Akiva is giving deference to Rabbi Shua and Rabbi Lezer. But because this Rabbi Tarfon later became his student, plus he's the chief rabbi, therefore he goes before Rabbi Tarfon. So the order in Rebbe's view is like this: Rabbi Lezer, the greatest of them all, goes first. Rabbi Shua goes next, because they were teachers of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah goes in the middle there, also before Rabbi Akiva, because he was the prince, he was the Nasi, he was the leader of the Jewish people. Rabbi Akiva goes before Rabbi Tarfon, because even though he learned from Rabbi Tarfon later became his student, and now that Rabbi Akiva is chief rabbi, he takes precedent over Rabbi Tarfon because he's in Bnei Brak. Okay. Now this idea that Rabbi Tarfon started out as Rabbi Akiva's teacher and later became a student, this is the Rebbe's Chiddush. It seems like the Rebbe is the source for this. I don't know that there's other sources for this. And the Rebbe writes, Kein Yesh Leimar. This is what we might suggest: that he started out first as teacher of Rabbi Akiva, and then later as student of Rabbi Akiva. And based on this, based on this understanding of the story, that Rabbi Tarfon was first Rabbi Akiva's teacher, and then became his friend. I'm sorry, not a student. Then became his friend. Then we'll understand very well. Yuvan Betuv will understand very well what the Gemara does in Exudes. Okay, so we have to unpack all of this. What's going on with this Tosfos here, with the two Tosfos in, and this Gemara in Exudes. So let's go. Okay, so I'm not going to learn this Gemara in Yevamis, which again, it's here in English, so I really recommend you print it out and read it. These are fascinating stories. Every one of them is fascinating stories. We're going to go straight to the Tosfos. The first Tosfos Rebbe quotes is the Tosfos in Exudes. And here, this Tosfos is commenting on the position of Rabbi Yossi Aglili relative to Rabbi Akiva. And here he says like this: Kinami Ashkechan, because we also find, right, because he wants to know over here why Rabbi Yossi Aglili is placed before Rabbi Akiva, even though Rabbi Yossi Aglili was a student of Rabbi Akiva. And the mission over there places Rabbi Yossi Aglili first, when seemingly Rabbi Yossi Aglili should be afterwards, because Rabbi Akiva was his teacher. So he says, so Rabbi Tosfos says, Kinami Ashkechan, because we also find Maisa, story about Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shua, Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah, and Rabbi Akiva. That's our story from the Haggadah. Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shua, Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah, and Rabbi Akiva. And Afish Rabbi Akiva haya chashuv Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah, even though Rabbi Akiva was greater than Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah, shaya roish lechachamim, because Rabbi Akiva was the head of all the Jewish scholars. Ubechol duchta minan, and we constantly say throughout the Gemara, Kagoin Rabbi Akiva v'chaberov. We always compare like Rabbi Akiva and his students, because Rabbi Akiva was like this leading scholar which everybody came and flocked to. So Rabbi Akiva was greater than Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah. And likewise, and the Gemara Yevamis, the story up here, which again I really recommend you read it, where there the Gemara says, Rabbi Doisa ben Hyrcanus, a story involving Rabbi Doisa, son of Hyrcanus, the Amar Lahem, which Rabbi Doisa ben Hyrcanus was in his old age, and they came to inquire about a certain halacha from him. A bunch of scholars came to inquire, and Rabbi Shua knew him, so Rabbi Shua led the charge in the conversation with Rabbi Doisa. The Amar Rabbi Shua said, Ani Elech, I will go to visit Rabbi Doisa, because the sages got together, they want to approach Rabbi Doisa about a certain question. So Rabbi Shua said, I will go. Va'achar of me, and then they said, who's going to follow you, Rabbi Shua? Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah is going to follow you. Va'achar of me, and who's going to follow Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah? Rabbi Akiva. So you see here, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah again put before Rabbi Akiva. This is consistent. Our story in Haggadah puts Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah first, and Rabbi Akiva puts, and this story where they're going to Rabbi Doisa, it starts Rabbi Yeshua, then Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, and then Rabbi Akiva. Same order as we have it in our Haggadah. Yeshua, Eliezer ben Azariah, and Rabbi Akiva. Now, this is when they decided to go meet him. But when they actually got to him, to Rabbi Doisa, Amar Rabbi Yeshua, he asked Rabbi Yeshua, Yesh ben Azariah, Chavarenu, does our friend Azariah have a son? Meaning to say, he never even heard of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is the son of Azariah. This is the Nasi, the leader of the Jewish people, the prince. And this Rabbi Doisa never heard of him. Because when Rabbi Yeshua introduced him and said, this is Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, Rabbi Doisa said, our friend Azariah has a son? Oh, nice to know. Because he never heard of Rabbi Eliezer before. Okay. But Rabbi Akiva, but when it came to Rabbi Akiva, Amar, Rabbi Doisa said, Atahu, are you the one? Are you the one whose reputation goes from one end of the world to the other end of the world? So this Rabbi Doisa never heard of Eliezer ben Azariah, but he did hear of Rabbi Akiva. But nonetheless, Rabbi Eliezer comes first. For what reason? This is because he came from a lineage, a greater lineage than Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva also had lineage because he was 10 generations from Ezra the scribe. But also because he was prince. So here this is the source that Rebbe said that the reason why Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah comes before Rabbi Akiva, even though Rabbi Akiva is a much greater scholar, as you can see from the story of Doisa, that Doisa never heard of Eliezer ben Azariah, but he heard of Rabbi Akiva's reputation, and yet we put Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah first. Why? Because he comes from a great family, and because he's the prince. Because that's the first Tosfos that ever quoted. The second Tosfos, oh no, I'm sorry, this isn't the Tosfos where he talks about Rabbi Yisrael Gili. This is the Tosfos where he talks about Rabbi Yisrael Gili. Never Zara. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Okay, I don't want to take up too much time here, but looking at this Tosfos, let's look at the main point here. Right, so Tosfos wants to know, Tosfos wants to know why Rabbi Yisrael Gili is coming before Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah. Why is he okay? So Tosfos wants to know why Rabbi Yisrael Gili is put before Rabbi Akiva when seemingly Rabbi Akiva was a student. When seemingly Rabbi Akiva was a teacher of Rabbi Yisrael Gili. So it says Tosfos in Nira, the Talmud Chavar Haya would seem that Rabbi Akiva was a student, but that was also Rabbi Yisrael Gili, was a student that was also a friend of Rabbi Akiva. The Rachman was a little bit younger. Now, even though elsewhere Rabbi Yisrael Gili is listed before Rabbi Akiva, when seemingly Rabbi Akiva is a student, like Kasha, don't be so concerned with it. The Kamoi Kain Maske B'Haggadah of Pesach, because the same thing is in the Haggadah of Pesach. This is the words we're coming from. Rabbi Akiva Kodim of Tarfon. Rabbi Akiva before of Tarfon. Shoyer Rabbi, where Rabbi Tarfon was a teacher. So Tosfos kind of is left with like this, shrugged shoulders, saying, look, I understand we're putting Rabbi Yisrael Gili before Rabbi Akiva, even though Rabbi Akiva is his teacher. But there's precedent for that because look, Rabbi Tarfon is a teacher of Rabbi Akiva, and yet Rabbi Akiva is put before Rabbi Tarfon. Where do we see that? We see that in the Haggadah of Pesach. Now on this is what the Rebbe comments and says that no, you don't have to say that. You don't have to say that Rabbi Akiva goes before Rabbi Tarfon even though he's a student, because Rabbi Akiva started out as a student of Rabbi Tarfon, but later became a friend. This is what the Rebbe is addressing. Is this Tosfos? Okay, this is the Gemara in Sanhedrin, which tells us that Rabbi Akiva was the leader of Bnei Brak. Again, I encourage you to look at it. Okay, there's really so much to do here. What I want to show you is, okay, the Gemara in Exudes. This is the Gemara in Exudes. The Gemara says like this. We'll read it in English, makes it quicker. Right? The Rebbe said that by suggesting that Rabbi Tarfon started out as Rabbi Akiva's teacher and then later became his friend, first of all, it explains why Rabbi Akiva comes first. Because it's true, it's his teacher, but now it's his friend. And considering that Rabbi Akiva is now chief rabbi, therefore he sits before Rabbi Tarfon. That's number one. Number two, the Rebbe said, this is going to explain very well the Gemara in Exudes. So what's so problematic in the Gemara in Exudes that this is being explained very well now? So it says the Gemara, they're like this. This is what the Gemara says. The Gemara relates, there were judges who judged a case of this kind. in accordance with Rabbi Tarfon. The Mishnah relates to the dispute between Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, and the Gemara then tells us that there was a certain judge who ruled in accordance with Rabbi Tarfon instead of in accordance with Rabbi Akiva. Now, Reish Lakish reversed the decision, reversed the action. He dismissed the Saz's decision and resolved the money to be the heirs in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Okay. Rabbi, oops, what just happened there? Back. What just happened? No. Further down. My apologies. Must have clicked on something by accident. Yeah, here we are. So, if you can't see, please tell me. So there was a certain judge who ruled in accordance with Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Reish Lakish reversed the opinion, and Rabbi Yochanan said, no, you acted in accordance to Torah. Don't worry about it. You can uphold the law. So why is Reish Lakish reversing the law when he ruled like Rabbi Tarfon, and Rabbi Yochanan upholding? The truth is, he should have paskened like Rabbi Akiva, because in general, the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva. And yet this judge ruled in accordance with Rabbi Tarfon. But the question is, should the ruling be overturned or not? Because it's not so simple to overturn the ruling of a judge. And there has to be, the mistake the judge has to have made has to have been such a terrible mistake to the point that it's worth reversing the ruling. So why did Reish Lakish reverse the ruling and Rabbi Yochanan uphold it? So the Gemara gives three different answers. Number one, you might say that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan are disputing. That one sage, Reish Lakish, holds that this is that he erred in a matter that appears in the Mishnah. In other words, because he ruled like Rabbi Tarfon instead of Rabbi Akiva, it's such a grave mistake that it has to be revoked. Whereas one sage, Rabbi Yochanan, holds that this is not such a big deal, even though he didn't rule like Rabbi Akiva, it's not such a big deal. Answer number one. Answer number two is, one sage, Rabbi Yochanan, holds that the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva, whereas the other one says, no, the halacha doesn't follow Rabbi Akiva. Third answer, if you want, you can say that where is it? One sage, Rabbi Yochanan, holds that Rabbi Tarfon was Rabbi Akiva's teacher, and one sage, Rabbi Lakish, holds that Rabbi Tarfon was a colleague. So if Rabbi Akiva is a teacher, you have to overturn the Mishnah, because you can't rule like Rabbi Tarfon against his teacher. Whereas Reish Lakish says he was a colleague. Okay. And the other one says that no, really, everyone agrees that Rabbi Tarfon was a colleague, not a teacher. But they're arguing as to whether or not you follow Rabbi Akiva. Okay, this is a different thing. Sorry?
So it seems like none of these reasons seem to give a proof of why it was reversed.
So it would seem to me that what Rebbe is trying to say is that the ambiguity in the Mishnah, in the Gemara here, was he a teacher, was he not a teacher? If he is a teacher, is he a colleague? Gemara goes back and forth. And it seems to me that the Rebbe is saying that the ambiguity is understood, is explained, if it's true that Rabbi Tarfon was first his teacher and then a student. Now the ambiguity is clear, because it's a question of timeline. And when did this happen? And to what degree does Rabbi Tarfon retain his teacher status, even after he stops being a teacher? Right? So in other words, in general, we have a rule that we don't argue about history. Either it happened or it didn't happen. You don't argue about history. You can argue about law, but arguing about history is a funny thing to argue about. Either it happened or it didn't happen. But based on what the Rebbe is saying, that Rabbi Tarfon started out as a teacher and then became a student, I think this is what the Rebbe is trying to say. Now this Gemara makes sense. The ambiguity is clear now. Because he is a teacher, but then he became a friend. Maybe he still retains his status as a friend even after he's a teacher. I'm sorry, maybe he still retains his status as a teacher even after he's a friend. There's room for ambiguity because of the change that happened. So this seems to be what the Rebbe is trying to do.
Based on the time frame of it.
Yes, because the time frame, because we don't know what the time frame is, so the ambiguity in the Gemara is explained. Because if not for the Rebbe's comment that Rabbi Tarfon started out as a teacher and then became a colleague, the Gemara's ambiguity seems curious. Like, why aren't you clear? Don't you know the history? Was he a teacher or not a teacher? Like, what are you unclear about? And now we know why they're unclear. Yeah.
But you'd have to know the timeline of the decisions and how that factored into when they changed it or didn't.
Exactly, which would explain the ambiguity precisely. Either you have to factor in the timeline, or maybe even if the decision was made after he became a colleague, maybe the fact that he used to be a teacher still keeps his status, right? Because there's a change in what happened to Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva's relationship, it explains the ambiguity in the Gemara. That's what I think the Rebbe is trying to hint to. Okay, there's two more things I want to share with you. The first is, the Rebbe said here, go back to the Rebbe's comment. Yeah, it's here. Yeah, the Rebbe said that Rabbi Yeshua goes before Rabbi Akiva because he was a teacher. And for sure, Mikol Shken much more so than Rabbi Lezer. Why is Rabbi Lezer how much more so than Rabbi Yeshua? So I quoted two Gemaras in the sources. The Rebbe doesn't put a source for why Rabbi Yeshua is a teacher, and certainly Rabbi Lezer. The Rebbe doesn't explain why. But I put two sources here that will give you some clarity. And again, when you print them out, I want you to read them. The first is the Mishnah in Avos, the famous Mishnah in Avos, where Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, I had 5 students. And one of the 5 students he has is Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Eliezer ben Hyrcanus is the same Rabbi Lezer. And one of the other 5 students is Rabbi Yeshua. And there the Mishnah says that if all scholars were on one side and Eliezer ben Hyrcanus on the other, Eliezer ben Hyrcanus would weigh them down. Right? So Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, Rabbi Lezer, outweighs Rabbi Yeshua. So certainly Rabbi Lezer, if Rabbi Yeshua goes before Rabbi Akiva, then certainly Rabbi Lezer does, because Rabbi Lezer outweighs Rabbi Yeshua. That's one Mishnah that perhaps explains why it's Rabbi Yeshua and certainly Rabbi Lezer. And another story, this is a fascinating story that I really, really would like for you to read it. The story is this one right here. It's in the Gemara and Bab Metzia. No, sorry, not the one Yevamit. That's also an interesting story. You mentioned that earlier with Rabbi Doisa. But there's a story in, where is it? The story is in Bab Metzia here. Bab Metzia, Daf Nun Tes, page 59, A and B. An unbelievable story. And there the story is that Rabbi Lezer, claimed the halacha to be a certain way. And Rabbi Yeshua stood up and said, no, the halacha follows the majority, and you, Rabbi Lezer, are in the minority, and therefore we cannot follow you. Rabbi Lezer said, if I am right, you're going to see a heavenly voice is going to come out from heaven and say that I'm right. And a heavenly voice came out and said, yes, Rabbi Lezer is right. And yet Rabbi Yeshua said, I'm sorry, too bad. Torah is not in heaven. Torah gets decided down here, and therefore we'll reject Rabbi Lezer's opinion. So here you see that Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Yeshua are equals. Rabbi Yeshua is arguing with Rabbi Lezer and standing, even though Rabbi Lezer is making miracles, as the Gemara describes there. Rabbi Lezer makes a miracle to prove that he's right. Rabbi Yeshua still stands his ground and says no. So Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Lezer, both students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, as we learned in the Mishnah and Avos, they are of equal and they argue with each other. Right? But the story goes on and says that the end was that because of Rabbi Lezer's insistence, they actually excommunicated him. Not they ostracized him. Where's the language here? Yeah, he was ostracized. And they wanted to know who's going to tell Rabbi Lezer about this ostracism. Who should break the news to him? So who did they send? They sent Rabbi Akiva. Because Rabbi Akiva is a beloved student of Rabbi Lezer. So Rabbi Akiva was sent to go break the news to Rabbi Lezer. And there's a whole story about how he did that. And I really, really urge you to read the story. It's a fascinating story. So again, here you see in the story that Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Lezer are equals. And Rabbi Akiva, if he has reverence for Rabbi Yeshua, then certainly for Rabbi Lezer, toward whom he had this whole, he was the one to break the news to Rabbi Lezer, that your colleagues, Rabbi Yeshua and the others, ostracized you. So you'll see from these two texts why it is that if Rabbi Yeshua comes before Rabbi Lezer, certainly Rabbi Lezer does. I'm sorry, if Rabbi Yeshua comes before Rabbi Akiva, certainly Rabbi Lezer does. All to say that in this explanation, why do we have the order as it is? The order is as follows. Rabbi Lezer is the greatest of them. He goes first. Rabbi Yeshua is a teacher of Rabbi Akiva. He goes second. Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah is prince. He goes third. Rabbi Akiva goes fourth, even though he's greater, certainly greater than Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah, but we put him after Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah in deference to the Nasi, to the leader, and in deference to his two teachers, Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Lezer. Now he comes before Rabbi Tarfon, because even though Rabbi Tarfon was his teacher, he later became a student. And because Rabbi Akiva is the chief rabbi in Bnei Brak where the story happens, therefore he's placed before his former teacher, Rabbi Tarfon. That's the explanation right now. And then we'll conclude with the Rebbe's second explanation for why the order. This is great. There's more, but I'm going to leave the rest out. But we'll just conclude with this. Rebbe writes, La'achar zman, after some time, Matzasi I found. Now, in the footnote, Rebbe 11 writes that this paragraph was added in a later edition. Right? I mentioned that the Haggadah was printed in 1946. In the edition of 1957, Rebbe added this paragraph, where Rebbe writes, La'achar zman, after some time, Matzasi I found, Yesh mefarshim, that those who explain, Seder, that the order of how they're sitting, Rabbi Lezer, Rabbi Shua, Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah, Rabbi Kiva, Rabbi Tarfon, that order specifically. Al pi ma'amar Rabbi Seiner Zechron Levracha, based on that which the Gemara says in Brachas. Seder Heseba, the order of the way, the Mishnah, the Gemara is there discussing the proper way to sit around the table and how people should be organized in accordance to their station. So the Gemara there says, Hagadol be'emtza, the leader of the pack should be sitting in the middle. Sheni loy, second to him, Lamaila, Himena should be above him, meaning to his left, I think, meaning above him, meaning he would be sitting on the right side. And Shlishi le'lamata Himena, and then those should be below him to his right. Yes? So that when you're facing him, you see his second people, the second in command to his right. Oh, no, I'm sorry. The greater ones sit to his right. Those who are second to the greatest sit to the right of him. And those who are less go to the left of him, which is below him. And therefore, according to this Hasei Boy Khan, the order is as follows. Hanasi, the leader of the Jewish people, is in the middle, Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah. The Nasi, which is Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah. Now, Rabbi Lezer ben Shua, Rabbi Yisrael Rabbi Kiva, who are the teachers of Rabbi Kiva, Lamayla Mahanasi, they go to the right of the Nasi, they go above him. Rabbi Kiva, Rabbi Tarfon, and Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Tarfon, the Mate men are lower than him. Okay, so let's see. And the Haggadah relates them as they are seated. So let's see. Let's imagine these are the 5 people and they're sitting in a semicircle. Right? So Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah is in the middle because he's the leader. He's the Nasi. Now, to his, it should be the other way around. I apologize because in English, you go this way, but in Hebrew, it's the other way. So, but to Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah's right, are the 2 teachers of the previous generation. Teacher 1 goes farthest, highest to the right, and teacher 2, Rabbi Shua, goes second on the right-hand side, because those are the 2 teachers of Rabbi Akiva. Now to the left would go his 2 colleagues, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon, who are the next generation, right? Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Shua are students of Rabbi Yochanan and Zakkai, they're the previous generation. Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah is the prince, so he goes right in the middle, but then Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon, who are the next generation, they go to the left of the leader of the Jewish people. But Rabbi Akiva would still go first, presumably, because he's the chief rabbi. Right? So therefore, when the Haggadah lists them, even though they list them, Rabbi Lezer, then Rabbi Shua, then Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah, then Rabbi Akiva, then Rabbi Tarfon, you actually should read it, Rabbi Lezer, highest in command, and then to his right, Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Shua, and then to his left, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon. But when you look at them right to left, the order goes this way. Rabbi Lezer, then Rabbi Shua, then Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah, then Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon. But really, the order starts from the middle here, being the greatest. So this is 2 explanations for the order. And in this commentary, again, I urge you to look at it. The Rebbe there writes that this is the reason why, or one of the reasons why the story begins by saying where they are, that they're in Bnei Brak. Because by saying they're in Bnei Brak, now we know that Rabbi Akiva is the chief rabbi, and now we know why it's before Rabbi Tarfon. And that would explain why the story has the word Bnei Brak. Okay, so I hope we got some clarity. I hope we found this interesting. And I really urge you to print these texts and look at the stories because they're fascinating, and it'll give you a much fuller picture of what we meant when we said that Rabbi Akiva was a student of these people, and yet he outpaced them, or at least he outpaced Rabbi Tarfon certainly. And we'll also see the relationship between Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Shua, how they are equals, and then Rabbi Akiva, who's below them, but Rabbi Akiva is like this prize student to both Rabbi Shua and Rabbi Lezer, as the stories there demonstrate. Which is why Rabbi Shua and Rabbi Lezer come first, and then Elazar ben Azariah, the Nasi, in the middle, Rabbi Akiva to the left, being the chief rabbi before his former teacher, Rabbi Tarfon. All right, so hopefully you enjoyed that, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Comments or questions? Welcome. If you have any comments or questions, of course, always welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Good night.
Good night.
Just wondering if the Rebbe had some sort of, in addition to just knowing the order of these sages, if it had any other relevance to the story of telling the story of the Exodus, or anything in addition to the Seder. Was there any connection to it?
Not in the order, but there are halachic implications to them being there. We already saw one before, that Kohen, Levi, and a convert also has to say the story. But then there are others. The Rebbe cites 2 different opinions that Rabbi Lezer had and Rabbi Lezer ben Azariah had, and why their being at the story indicates a certain nuance in their halacha. The Rebbe actually does talk about that, but not in terms of any other overarching significance that I found at least.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
When does a ger, at which point does a ger have an obligation to tell the story?
The moment he becomes a convert. I don't know. What do you mean?
The moment? That moment?
What do you mean?
Even though he wasn't even there to begin with.
Yes, that's what I said. We didn't get into that tonight, but Rebbe does have a comment about that at the beginning. Rebbe quotes from the Ohr HaChaim and other sources, and the Rambam, Rebbe goes through why it is. And the bottom line is,
Because it says we were slaves. He was never a slave.
he quotes the Ohr HaChaim because even though they weren't there physically, they were there spiritually.
Right.
And they were there. They were also there spiritually in some way. Yeah, and therefore, if the spirituality of the Jewish people would have been stuck in Egypt, then this person who is a convert would have never become a convert because there would have never been the option for him to get to that level of holiness because that level of holiness would have been trapped in Egypt. That's essentially what the Ohr HaChaim writes. They were quoted that earlier.
What?
Ronan time before his wife died.
Sorry?
Hello?
Yeah.
Okay, so I hope that answered the question. And we're wonderfully
So I have a question. I have a question. It's the first time I ever heard, and I understood that Aaron and Moses went to see Pharaoh, that the Levim weren't slaves, they were free to roam? So
that's interesting because so the Haggadah points out, we quoted from the Haggadah earlier, that they weren't free to leave Egypt, but they were not slaves.
Wouldn't the Israelites who were getting the lashes be a little peeved, perhaps, at their fellow Jews walking around on the back nine while they're,
maybe, I don't know, maybe. I'm sure there's some comments about that. I'm sure there's some commentary about that.
If you find...
Actually, in some ways that happens when Moshe Rabbeinu comes and tries to get them free, and then Paro makes it worse. The Jews kind of look at him and say, you guys, you and Aaron, you guys aren't part of the slavery. You guys waltz along trying to help us, and you make it worse. So there is kind of that attitude. So maybe
it's a little, that's
maybe it adds to it. The Jews initially are very upset at Moshe Rabbeinu for making it worse, right? So maybe the fact that they were never part of slavery adds to that frustration.
Well, when they came there, they were excited because they knew the words and they thought that we were going to be freed. Yeah. But obviously, it was rough. Every good thing takes time. It's not easy in the beginning, but I'm just imagining, like these guys are getting their skulls crushed in, and these guys are on the back nine going to the beer hole, like.
Well, actually, they were busy preserving Torah as they heard it from Jacob and Isaac and Abraham. That's what they were doing. But either way, I'm not familiar, but I'm sure there is a midrashic and commentary on this. I'm certain.
If you ever get it, I would never ask. Yeah, but if you come across something, let me know. I really want to.
I'll tell you where to go. I'll tell you where to look.
For sure. Thank you.
Look in the Maamorim. We have it in English in our library. It's called the Torah Anthology. The Torah Anthology. It's a wonderful translation by Aryeh Kaplan of a classic midrashic commentary called the Maamorim. And this commentary, the Torah Anthology, goes through the entire scripture and gives all the backstory. So if you find the Torah Anthology on the book of Exodus, the book of Shmuel, on Parshat Shemot and Va'era, those parshas, I'm sure you'll find commentary on that. I'm sure.
I'm going to check it out. Thank you.
That would be the place to look. And just for reference, Scott Miller has read through, all, but a lot of the Torah Anthology, so he might be familiar too.
I'll give him a call right away. Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Okay, wonderful night.
Have a good evening. Thank you.
Night. Thank you.